Okay, so I'd like to do a brief presentation on what I shall call Second Temple Judaisms. One of the other titles I had thought about was The Parting of the Ways, and another was Sisters or Mother and Daughter as it relates to Judaism and Christianity. But I settled on Second Temple Judaisms. I say Second Temple Judaisms in the plural because there were many. Most of us know about the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Then there were the Essenes, who are believed to have written the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the Zealots, and any number of either unnamed, unremembered, or splinter organizations that were active during the Second Temple time. And oftentimes these were not as well demarcated as they are today, let's say between Reform and Conservative, etc. Many Christian believers seem to think that Jesus came to earth and poof, Christianity was a religion. I don't mean any disrespect in that poof, but nothing could be any farther from the truth. We see this in the New Testament itself, where Paul offers a sacrifice for the returning Nazarites in Acts 21:26. And Jesus and his disciples continued to pay the temple tax, Matthew 17, which went to pay for the sacrifices, and they continued to go to the temple, Acts 2 and 3, in the synagogue. The complete split between the two faiths probably came about sometime in the 2nd century, some 70 to 150 years after the death of Jesus. The Second Temple was destroyed in 70 CE, or AD as it's more commonly known. CE is Common Era. That's the more scientific and inclusive term. I used to think that the destruction of the temple was the final calamity that led to the separation of Christianity from Judaism, much like I believe it indeed was the final straw in the shift from sacrificial Judaism to Pharisaic Judaism. However, I've rethought this on behalf of Christianity. Jesus, as well as his followers, and certainly most of the rabbis and Jews of his day, knew that it was just a matter of time before the temple would be destroyed. Jesus actually begins to transform the temple from an external to an internal spiritual place, and Pharisaic Judaism likewise transformed it into the service of the heart, i.e. prayer, and elevating the home and the synagogue into the place of central worship. For the Jews, the transition had been coming for over 200 years as the rabbis transitioned from Israelite Judaism to Torah Judaism. In Christianity, it took a bit longer. Certainly, the death of Jesus was unexpected, and the shock shook the community to its very core. One might think that this might be the end of the Nazarite movement, but it didn't end there. It is often difficult to abandon someone or something you have believed in wholeheartedly and for some time. His followers looked for some clue as to why this happened. In time, just as with other failed messianic movements, it was clear that there was a reason for the calamity, and it had been one that the early believers simply did not see, which I think takes a little hubris. The Messiah was to die for the sins of the world and would return to fulfill the messianic prophecies. Indeed, Shabtai Tzvi, who was given the choice of conversion to Islam or death, the Messiah, as foretold in the prophets, was to convert to Islam all along as part of the divine plan. This cognitive dissonance is not at all uncommon under the circumstance. About 35 years after the death of Jesus, when the temple was destroyed, both faiths were obviously shaken. Jesus was an anti-temple apocalyptic preacher, so this may have been a bit easier on the Nazarite community, since they had already had their major kerfuffle with Jesus' death. But one more catastrophe, this one, the violent death of another messianic figure, may have been enough to cause the schism. The Bar Kokhba revolt, in which Rabbi Akiva, who is thought by many to be the Messiah, was brutally murdered, while the remainder of the Jews of that time were either killed or enslaved after that revolt failed. Some historians believe that having another messianic figure come and go, much like Jesus, was more than the movement could withstand. At this point, continuing to wait on the return of Jesus was no longer within the pale of Judaism. Likewise, there may have been some divine elements in his followers' beliefs about him at this point, circa 135 CE. And at that point, they simply had to leave Judaism proper. We will discuss some of the other idiosyncrasies and differences in the Messianic thought briefly below. Evidence of a later separation of the faiths includes a blessing against heretics, which was added to the Amidah. When called to say the prayer, those who were outside the pale of normative Judaism would not be able to do so or say this blessing, thus outing themselves. Estimates put this edition somewhere between 190 and 230 CE, and this would indicate that there were Jewish Christians in the synagogue well and into the 3rd century, worshiping alongside their Jewish counterparts in peace and without too much strife. As I mentioned before, there is nothing heretical about believing that someone is Messiah. One simply watches and waits, and if he fulfills the prophecies of the Hebrew Scriptures that speak of the Messiah and what will happen when Messiah is here, then he is the Messiah. Throughout the ages, there have been hundreds of Messianic candidates. I've mentioned a couple, including Jesus. Most of them died violent deaths as claiming to be the king. When one lives in a subjugated empire, does not necessarily lead to a long life. Remember that Jesus was crucified not for being the one who would save the Jews from their sins, etc., but rather was crucified for sedition as the king of the Jews. Not being one to reinvent the wheel, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of podcasts on why Jesus did not fulfill the Messianic prophecies. I would recommend the reader to Jews for Judaism for a good start, and I know Rabbi Skovak and Jono did an extensive and quite excellent one-by-one jump into each of the 365 prophecies that Messianic prophecies that Jesus supposedly fulfilled. I'd also recommend that series. I also have a podcast below that briefly discusses this point. For a synopsis of the mutually agreed upon, both Christian and Jewish, Messianic prophecies, I recommend the reader look at Ezekiel 37, where I think all of them, if not most of them, are annotated, but no one to date has fulfilled them. Thus, Messiah has not come. So I hope that helps. I do want to say that a lot of what I've talked about today is not necessarily original to my brain. I read and listen extensively to the experts, and Dr. Shay Cohen, Dr. Bart Ehrman, Dr. Amy Jill Levine, Dr. Henry Abramson. Those are some of my frequent sources, and so some of what I have said today may reflect some of their teachings and their beliefs as well. Thank you for listening, and wish you a good week. Shalom.